if you do the strategy of outsourcing in the way that I'm going to recommend it to you, the money will be optimized all on its own.
I wonder if this is you. Your human resources are strained. You have new clients or new funding, or maybe just a new project that you know your team isn't big enough to handle. You've heard of outsourcing, but you're not sure how to do it right. This is Alex Selensky, and you've found it, Tech and Startups, the #1 channel for leaders in technology. Yes, this is the right time to hit that subscribe button and the bell to make sure that you stay up to date on tech and startups. In this video, you are going to get the secret to elastic human resources, the 2 most important factors for outsourcing well, and the 2 top tips for getting started. I've been building and expanding technology teams in Silicon Valley and around the world for about 10 years. This presentation was initially filmed as part of my Tech and Startups virtual conference series.
What can be outsourced? Ops can be outsourced. Architecture can be outsourced. Back-end development, front-end development, sales can be outsourced. QA can be outsourced. Design can be outsourced. Everything can be outsourced. Everything can be outsourced if you know how to do it. Some things are easier, some things are harder. We're going to talk a little bit about that. But first, this is about resource elasticity. So you're probably already using it. If you're using a service like AWS, then you're using elasticity. It's probably the reason you have it. You take what you have, you put it on a server. You don't have to decide how much bandwidth you're going to need. You don't have to decide how much processing power you're going to need. As you need more bandwidth, as you need more processing power, services like AWS provide it to you. And when you need less of it, it'll shrink it back down again. And so this is a strategy to help with resource elasticity. I want you to have the right resources at the right time and optimize on that way. A lot of times people are optimizing for money. We're outsourcing, or we're offshoring, or we're doing other practices to try to get the best deal. But if you do the strategy of outsourcing in the way that I'm going to recommend it to you, the money will be optimized all on its own.
Now I'm ready to hear from you. Have you outsourced before? Tell me yes or no in the comments below.
So we've got some leading variables. So what are the variables we think about first? Do we think about money? We talked about money, right? Do we think about language? Is language an important variable? What about pedigree? What about those high college degrees? What about those places with reputations? What about Silicon Valley? Are we worried about those things? Are we worried about missing out on those things? I don't think so. If we use 2 leading variables, the rest will follow. You're probably familiar in economic talk with the idea of a leading indicator. It's the number or the value that we can look at that suggests a lot about the rest of the world. So these are leading variables that we can work with for outsourcing, and there are 2 of them that are important. The first one is time zone. I want to think in terms of overlap. So there's an overlap in time zone. When is it important? When is it not so important? And culture. We want to think about what is the necessary overlap in culture. So an overlap in time zone is, are my working hours the same working hours as the folks who I'm working with, who I'm outsourcing with? And is that important? And then overlap in culture. How important is that overlap in culture going to be? I want to caveat this by saying that we've all agreed today that diversity is really important and it brings in new perspectives. So we want to keep in mind that diversity is really important, that having a lot of cultures is really important, especially having cultures inside our building that represent the cultures outside our building that we want to address. It's not really what this is about. This is about cultural communication. So in culture, we're thinking we define that as overlap in language, in the media. And by media, I mean the media we're used to. In a place like Nigeria, the proportion of American media is a lot bigger. So there actually may be a greater cultural overlap between someone from the United States and someone from Nigeria, simply because they have access to a lot of the same media. That's what I'm looking at. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about cultural overlap, to understanding communication style, traditions, lifestyle.
So here we're looking at that overlap between time and culture. We want to think about the kind of roles where a time overlap or a cultural overlap may or may not be necessary. So we start with QA, quality assurance. This is testing. If we're really doing a great job of preparing our testers, our quality assurance professionals for the work, we're communicating very explicitly. The conversation we're having is when user does X, the result ought to be Y. Is that true? And so when we do that, we don't really need a lot of cultural overlap here because the directions are so explicit and usually so objective. We don't need a lot of time overlap. It's not usually important that our quality assurance team is working with us at the same time. In fact, it can make your team more efficient. It can make your team a 24-hour team if your quality assurance professionals are in an entirely different time zone. It's actually an advantage to have quality assurance in a different time zone. Next, we have phone support. Phone support's a place, again, where you might really want phone support to be available outside of your normal time zone hours. But the cultural overlap is going to be very important. You want to have a cultural overlap between your phone support professionals and the people that they are supporting, because there's a lot of communication happening, and it's a lot of communication in real time. Next, we have tech ops. Tech ops is that role that keeps all the servers running, sees if there are any errors. This is a place where maybe you want a lot more of a time overlap, but the cultural overlap isn't so important because, again, the decisions are objective. Now, this is flexible. Tech ops could go up and down that time overlap spectrum, but in times of emergency, you may want a greater time overlap. So I would say this is placed a little bit high, and the time overlap doesn't need to be quite that high. A solutions architect is a place where you're going to want a little more cultural and communication overlap. You're going to want a little more time overlap. It doesn't have to be one-to-one, but you're going to want to have them available for a few hours during everyone else's business day, and you're going to want them to be able to communicate well with you and your clients and your other touch points. And finally, direct sales is probably the place where you really need a one-to-one in time and culture overlap. Your direct sales professionals are going to be talking to the clients that you're seeking at their normal business hours, at their normal times for speaking, and they're going to really need a strong cultural overlap with those potential customers. So wherever you are, whatever culture you are in, whatever time zone you are in, you want your direct salespeople to be working and operating and thinking in that time, in that culture. And so that's how we think about these two leading variables. If you can follow time, if you can follow culture, all the other variables, including the money, will optimize themselves.
Okay, let's have a vote. Which is more important to you? Type, culture, or time zone in the comments below. Here, Lindsay Gumley jumps in with some questions about starting with outsourcing. She is the co-founder and CEO of an innovation lab.
First question, where should businesses start to find their outsourced teams?
So it's a good question. For me, I've been working with teams around the world for a while now, and so I have firms that I work with. I have firms in India, I have firms in Latin America, I have firms in America. For me in general, because of the teams I'm working with, they want to expand quickly. So I don't often want individuals sometimes, but often I want already functioning teams because I'm probably developing some kind of new feature or a new product altogether. So I want a team that's already working well together, that already has a project manager, that already has a few developers, that already has QA designers, things like that. So I prefer that. A lot of times cost and situation doesn't allow for it. So then I might go for an individual or a couple of individuals. No problem there. So I'm first going to the relationships that I already have around the world. But if I were doing this for the first time, I would probably start in a place like Upwork, and I would probably be thinking less about where to find the people and more about again, my time overlap, my cultural overlap, and how I'm going to interview and assess them.
What if a company can't or doesn't want to go international for whatever reason? but they still need to optimize in cost?
Yeah. So the trick is everyone wants to be in the big city, I think, and we have our office there, right? And so if that's what we're doing, then it's going to be really hard. So two ways to optimize that, even without leaving the country that you're in, is one, get out of the city. So maybe be comfortable with remote work, or have your office outside of the big cities. Have them in these places that aren't so expensive. The cost of living isn't so high, and it's a little less competitive, the job market. So you're either physically moving out of the city or looking for work out of the city. That's one way. The other way is, again, coming back to pedigree. I'm very good at finding underrated talent, and underrated means I'm finding talent that doesn't have the university backing, maybe wasn't working for a big company before, maybe in some cases doesn't have a college degree. And so if I'm willing in my application process, my hiring process, my interviewing process to be a little more creative, and instead of filtering on the college degree or these other items of their experience, filter on the work that they can show me, again, through portfolio. I'm very happy to look at hackathon results. I'm very happy to look at a certificate earned outside of a college. And I'm very, very happy to look at someone who's built something that's very similar to the thing that I need. And so when I do that, I find talent that's underrated, and as a result, I can pay a little bit less for it. And the other great thing about that is everyone wins. I'm getting out of an overly competitive market. I no longer have to suffer that, and I give opportunity to people who otherwise are not getting opportunities because of the filters that people naturally put in place.
We've gotten some fantastic insights on strengthening your team, but what about other ways you can strengthen your team? I've assembled an 8-page guide on the 4 quadrants of strengthening your team with key insights from more than 11 veteran tech team leaders. To get yours, grab the link below this video. I'm so glad you joined us today. If this video was helpful, give it a like, go ahead and subscribe and hit the bell so that tech and startup videos continue to show up in your feed. I'll see you in the other videos.